Hello everyone and welcome to another Follett House Friday. My name is Jeremy and I'm the Museum Services Manager for the Sandusky Library and Follett House Museum. And this week we are staying with the and I wanted to talk about something that I've always found as being, I don't want to say strange, but it is, to me at least, is strange, or at least part of it. So we're going to talk about some of the papers that revolve around death and mourning, and mostly in the Victorian era, though not all of them. So examples. So let's start with kind of mourning memorabilia that sticks with papers. So when a famous figure would die, usually they would print something or make something to help commemorate those people who had died. Not talking about like programs at a funeral, though they had those, and we'll actually see an example of that. And I'm not talking about, newspapers. I'm talking about things that were kind of kept as a keepsake to help you to remember that person. Normally that would be done for famous people. So I actually have two examples from two different presidential deaths. One is from the Victorian age, but the one actually predates it. So let's go with the earliest one first. That's actually relatively old and fragile, so I have to be careful with it. So this is a mourning document from the death of George Washington. And if you look closely, you can see there's George Washington with a laurel wreath above him and an eagle. And at the bottom it reads, General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the United Armies of the United States, born February 11, 1732, died December 14, 1799. So this would have been printed right around the time, right after his death, as something that would circulate, and something for people to have kind of a keepsake and have a reminder of George Washington, because at the time when he died, he was the most important, probably the most famous American living at that time, that people not only in the United States knew, but would have known all around the world. Moving from the example of George Washington into the Victorian era, we have an example, and this one you may have seen before, for when Lincoln died. And it's a picture of Lincoln and George Washington together, trying to connect the dead, martyred Abraham Lincoln to George Washington. And at the bottom it reads, entered according to the Act of Congress in the year 1865 by J.A. Arthur in the clerk's office of the District of Columbia for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, Washington and Lincoln. And it says where it was printed. This example was printed in Philadelphia. Like it says, linking Washington and Lincoln together, even in 1865, which is still common today. All right, sorry, I got a message on my phone. I wanted to make sure it was still working. The next example, I talked a little bit about about mournings for funeral, but there was a whole business around informing people of a death in the family. It's called, I've heard it called mourning paper, mourning stationery, but it's a whole business. So here's an example. Fortunately, this doesn't have a year on it, but my guess, once again, would be Victorian era. So this is from Herd's Fine Stationery, Fabric Finish Mourning. So you can see here's the box. So this was, printed and sold and distributed. And when you open the box, you find a couple different things. So you find stationery that you can see is, it's blank. It's actually nice, like kind of thick paper. And it has a black border on it to symbolize, of course, death. And besides the paper, you actually had the envelopes. And the envelopes, as you can see, are bordered black all around the edges. And if you look on the back, all the seams in the back are also bordered black. So if you received a notice of this in the paper or in the mail, and you saw an envelope with the black on the outside, that meant that someone you know has died and you're being alerted to their death. And it's not just a couple pieces. If I pull it out here, you can see there's a whole pack of letters and envelopes that are all together. And, it makes sense if you have a large family and you're in charge of it. Unfortunately, especially in this time period where medicine isn't quite as good, people are going to die, and they're going to so you'll actually probably unfortunately use a fair bit of this, especially childhood diseases, informing people that children had died. So this was a whole industry and was printed, and you could buy it, and then you would have it if you ever needed it. So let me close this box back up real quick. And the black outline doesn't just stay with the stationery, it would extend to a funeral as well. So let me bring an example from a local man's funeral. So some of you may have heard of Jay Cook, very famous for being involved in finances during the Civil War, very famous, of course, around here. And of course, when he died, being a very important figure, his funeral would have been big, would have been a lot of people would known. So we have two items from his funeral, which I think are really interesting. One is a name card. Mrs. Charles D. Barney of Ogons, Pennsylvania. It's hard to read the name on the bottom, or the city on the bottom. So this would have been some sort of place card for the funeral, either marking where they're supposed to sit, or maybe once they sat to put it there. I'm not exactly 100% sure, but once again, it has that black to kind of represent funeral and death. And then we also have the in memoriam, which is the program for the funeral at the time. And if you go through it, and I may have to take my gloves off because I don't think in the front it says, in memoriam, J. Cook, entered into life August 10th, 1821, entered into rest February 16, 1905, with a Bible verse at the bottom. So I'll hold that up and you guys can see. And then as you go through, it has some prayers, some Bible verses. So this would be something they would have, some songs. So this is what they would have used at the funeral. And then it would have been a keepsake for someone to keep to help remember that person. And you can see it worked. We're, 1905? 115 years later over it, and it's still here. Someone saved it and then passed it on to the museum, and we were able to save it, and we were able to continue to use it for educational purposes and to talk about things like this. And the Victorians always had a very strange relationship with death. They had lots of ideas and rituals that went with it. Sometime, once we can all gather back together, I have an entire program that I've done once before. Some of you might have seen it, on death and dying in the Victorian era. And I would like to do it again, and I talk a little bit about this stuff and some of the other ideas, myths, legends that revolve around death in the Victorian era. And we've seen, the first week we did this, we talked about hair art and hair wreaths, and with death, once again, that's a Victorian trend. So the Victorian connection with death is fascinating. And the idea of the keepsakes with like Washington and Lincoln, that's not that surprising. When Garfield died, they did one for him. It's very, when someone famous dies and you have some sort of connection to them, you want to keep something to remember them. We do that even today. But it's interesting to me that that they designed stationery, not just for funerals, but stationeries that you would send in the mail. And that's all it was designed for, was for mourning stationery in the mail out. And that's I think gives you an interesting insight into what the Victorian ideal was and what they think of. And it's just, you have to remember the Victorian era, you still have a lot of death, just like through most of humankind. Medicine's slowly getting better, but it's not that much better. You still have a lot of childhood diseases, so death is something that they live with in an everyday sense, just like most of history. And they kind of embraced it and tried to find ways to talk about it and commemorate it and even honor it in ways. I know that's not the most uplifting Follett House Friday, unfortunately, but it's still really interesting. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to comment on this video. If you're I haven't seen any while we're live. If you comment later, I'm always happy to answer questions later. And I have the next couple weeks' ideas pretty well nailed down, but once we get into the second Friday in November, I don't really have any themes planned. So if you have any ideas that you'd like to see or even topic, put it in the comments. I'm always happy to help. And with that, I hope you all have a lovely Friday. Thank you for joining me for another Follett House Friday.